Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New York Botanical Garden. I'm here today with Jennifer Jewell and Jamaica Kincaid. I'm Carrie Barrett, the president of the New York Botanical Garden, and we're delighted today to be here celebrating Jennifer's new book, The Earth in Her Hands, a celebration of 75 extraordinary women working in the world of gardening and plants. Today, we're in conversation thanks to the Mellon Foundation, other friends at the New York Botanical Garden, and we're here in the Enid Haupt Conservatory in the middle of our orchid show. Many of you will know Jennifer from her award-winning public radio program, Cultivating Place. And her new book, which they'll talk about, The Earth in Her Hand, is an inspiring profile of some really accomplished women, including some who work here at the garden. Karen Daubman, our Associate Vice President for Exhibitions, is in the book. Marta McDowell, the botanist, Robin Wall-Kimmerer, landscape designer Edwina von Gaal, many, many others who we know so well. And we're just honored to have this book almost, on the eve of Women's History Month. It's really, really exciting to have you here. One of the women that Jennifer profiles in the book is Jamaica Kincaid, and we're so delighted to have you here with us today. Your work, which focuses on human relationships, gender, class, race, human health, can we say, yes, in these times? In these times, we're so, so appreciative that you're here with us today. You have won so many awards, and your novels, such as the autobiography of my mother and Annie John. You've written fiction, you've written nonfiction, and many, many essays during your 20-year career at The New Yorker. You're a gardener yourself.
Yes.
So passionate and perceptive about your work, and expanded the scope of garden writing in your essays and memoirs. Including your books called My Garden and your work about your walk in the Himalaya. I want to thank you both for being here today with us in this beautiful space. We may hear some dripping sounds, we may hear the natural ambient noise of the conservatory where we've placed this beautiful conversation between the two of you. I'm delighted now to turn it over to both of you, and thank you all for watching and for being here at the New York Botanical Garden. Thank you.
It is such a pleasure to be here today at the New York Botanical Garden with Jamaica Kincaid after that lovely introduction by Carrie, the president here. I am, of course, sorry that we are not in person. Very odd times, but also resourceful and innovative times in which we will learn to think maybe a little bit differently. In 2016, when I first started my public radio program and podcast in its current form, the 1-hour weekly Cultivating Place conversations on natural history and the human impulse to garden in Northern California, I knew that I wanted to have conversations about gardeners and gardening a little bit differently than had been done in most mainstream media. That very reason, wanting to talk about gardening and gardeners differently, was what urged me to start a public radio program to begin with. It allowed for talking about things that are often seen as visual in a way that was more intellectual and more kind of deeply ingrained with all of the senses, especially the sense of voice. When in 2016 the program started, in 2017 in December, Timber Press came to me and asked if I would be interested in writing a book about the current state of women in horticulture. And they were familiar with the way I handled my podcast and the way I interviewed my guests, to focus not so much on how we garden or how to garden, but on why we garden and the different ways in which people bring their social and political and spiritual and purpose-driven selves to this activity. So when I agreed to write the book, the first question became, how do you choose the women in the book, and why focus on this one or this many, and how do you encompass all that they are trying to accomplish in the world? And ultimately I came up with a kind of Gantt chart of different categories within horticulture that I found to be particularly vibrant and meaningful in this time in our world right now. And the categories include things like environmental science and botany. So that would be like field botanists who are working on forest land, or botanists here at the New York Botanical Garden who are researching plants and morphologies and diseases and trying to protect and conserve our biodiversity at the same time that they are trying to increase our awareness as general people about the many assets of that biodiversity, even if we don't understand it all. One of the categories within my many categories had to do with the written word and the ways in which garden writers have moved our understanding of gardening and horticulture in interesting and different ways than we would have seen in the past. So when it finally came to an ultimate list, I had 75 women, and they were all doing things that I considered to be expansive, to have taken our boundaries of what is horticultural and asked us to push them further. All of the women in the book are living, and they are all doing current work, and for the most part, their work has come to the fore in the last 25 years. So from 1995 until now. When Timber came to me, they had a beginning of a list, and then they asked me to fill it out. And it was the hardest thing to do, choosing women and including some and excluding others. And so what I like to say to everybody when I am talking about this work is that without question there are women in every room I find myself who should be in the book and aren't. And without question, anyone reading this book will look at the list of final women and they will say, I can't believe you forgot that one. And I say to everyone who is listening, this is a starting point. This is an invitation to find all the humans that you see doing good work in our green world, and you raise their names up. You amplify their voices and their work, and we make as long a list as we possibly can of people doing innovative and expansive work. When it came to the garden writers, it was without question in my mind that I would invite the writer, the author, the gardener, Jamaica Kincaid, to be a part of this work. It was an invitation because I asked each woman to commit, even in their busy lives, to an interview process that would take some time and some thought. I sent every woman in the book a list of questions. I don't know if you remember, Jamaica, how many there were, but there were maybe 20 questions.
It was quite a bit.
It was quite a bit. And so it was a requisite on my part that they have the time and the focus to send me those first written responses and then to engage with me in a conversation by phone or Skype or in person to explore those first answers a little more deeply. I have to share with people that I would say 2 women in the book were particular heroes of mine and so particularly intimidating to interview, and Jamaica Kincaid was one of them. And of all 75 women, And all of the scheduled interviews, I only messed up on the timing of one of them. And that one was Jamaica Kincaid. And we were scheduled to speak at a time, and I missed it, completely missed it in the time change. And she could not have been more gracious in understanding. And we rescheduled for another day. And I believe our final interview, when we spoke on the phone, ultimately, you were at your office at Harvard, and you had a student in the room with you. And so it was this lovely three-way conversation. The final list of 75 women included an enormously satisfying range of women doing different work at different stages in their life and for different purposes. One of the several recurring threads in the book was that each of these women connected their work with plants to their own personal joy. They also connected their work with plants and their personal joy to something of greater meaning to them in the world. And whether they did that purposefully or whether it happened as a secondary effect didn't seem to matter. They were called to do this work, and it was a 24/7 engagement on their part, which is not necessarily a terrible thing. One of the questions I asked each of the women was to describe to me their work-life balance. And there was a sort of resounding guffaw of derision and laughter combined, because like children, our plants don't take a break. They are there all the time. And these women and their passion with their work was something that was integral to their meaning and to their everyday lives. It's not something they could say goodbye to for a long weekend or an extended vacation. It was with them always. And the other thing that was really interesting to me in this whole process was how many gender roles have remained so consistent, even now in 2020. How many of these women were the primary caretakers for their children, for their elders? How many were that by choice, not just by circumstance, but by choice, and that it was important to them that their everyday lives were part of their work back and forth. Finally, I would say that one of the themes that was especially powerful to me, having been writing about gardens, thinking about gardens, and communicating about gardens for the past almost 20 years now, and this really happened almost as a side effect to the radio program, but was this idea of decolonizing our understanding of horticulture and gardening. And that is, I think, partly where Jamaica Kincaid comes in. In the mid-90s, I was a young mother in Seattle, Washington, with my own first garden, and the daughter of gardeners, and always excited to learn more about my plants, to learn their Latin names, and feel proud when I knew those Latin names. And in about 99 or 2000, it must have been 2000, my mother gave me a book for Christmas written by Jamaica Kincaid. And of course I had read Jamaica Kincaid in school, and I didn't know that she was a gardener at that time. And I read her book, my garden book, here, which was a compilation of essays she had written for The New Yorker about her own understanding of gardening and gardens and her own experience with it, very much in her own beautiful voice. And reading this book was like having an out-of-body experience where you are able to rise up about 2 degrees above the life you had been in before and see all of the area outside of what had been your understanding. I'm going to let her talk more about this, but one of the questions that I asked every woman in the book as well was, I asked a 2-part question. What is your greatest joy in this work? And what is your greatest challenge? And in her signature style, because she does not hold back, Jamaica said to me, my problem and challenge in the horticultural world is the same challenge I have in all parts of life, and that is racism. And so with that, I'm gonna start talking with Jamaica a little more. So I'd love to move now into chatting with you about your garden life journey and share with listeners and viewers how you first came to the garden, Jamaica.
Okay. I would say I would start with my mother, who was a gardener, but a gardener in the sense of a combination of Vertumnus and Pomona in the myth, one of the wood, one of the pruning and caring for the garden. That she had this way with the garden of being able to grow everything, but it would grow so madly, and she would get tired of how it behaved, and so she would chop it down and start all over again. And that was both frightening to me as a child, and also appealing, because I was drawn to her in this magnetic, beyond mother-daughter way. I was very, very drawn to her. But then my real entry into it was being given some very crude tools for a Mother's Day present, my first Mother's Day present. It was just sort of a joke, you know, and I immediately started to plant and to dig up, and everything I planted, nothing came up because they were in the wrong place. I knew nothing about how things worked. First of all, it was in a different climate from the one I grew up in. It was in Vermont. And but for me, nothing succeeds like failure. If I fail at something, I will do it again. It fascinates me, failure. So anyway, I started to plant this, I started to plant that, and I had success with it. And then I became more and more interested in what it meant to, where things came from, for instance, which, you know, would make sense because I myself was in a foreign place. So where did I come from? And as I started, I started with both flowers. The first flowers I met by accident, I saw these red shoots coming up in the lawn. I had just paid a lot of money to reseed, and I saw these red shoots coming up, and I was just about to call the landscaper in anger to say, I paid you all this money, and now look at these shoots coming up. And when I was told that they were peonies, and that Mrs. McGovern had a bed of peonies there. And so I thought, oh, peonies. And then just one thing led to the other, as if some, you know, some organ I had that had been dormant all these years just started to shoot out, and I became obsessed with the garden, and so that my friends would just say, we don't want to hear about the garden. And I had an editor named Veronica Gang, a brilliant woman, and she was so annoyed at me. She made me promise never to learn the Latin names of flowers. And I promised her that I wouldn't, but I did, and I never told her.
Always, always wiser. That wonderful description of the red shoots, the minute you said that, I knew what you were talking about. And any gardener who has grown peonies knows that just fat, little, sharp sprout coming out of the ground. And really, it's one of the first hints that the season is starting, and they go slowly, but
Yes.
so you have a wonderful quote. I think it's in my garden book, but it's certainly in the interview that you and I had with one another. And that really refers back to this experience you had of falling in love and then wanting more, and that first failure to thrive of your seeds was not a killing frost, but it was in fact a sort of stimulant of, I'm going to try this again.
Yes.
And you say that you did learn the Latin names because you were compelled to do this. And the quote in the book is that the garden brought the world to you, that all the things you loved, geography and botany and plants and history, were all together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Was I surprised by that? I don't even think I had time to be surprised. It just made such enormous sense. It was as if I had met my, I don't want to say intellectual, or maybe it's intellectual, spiritual, whatever. It was as if I had met the place that I was born to be in. Yeah. It was in the garden that I could study the diaries of the journals of Christopher Columbus, and read his description of first seeing the place where I was born, the island I was born, and to read his description of seeing the things that he had never seen before, and he had no names for them, so he would give them names that were familiar to him from Spain, Genoa, wherever he had been. And that led me to the understanding of possession, that you possess, one of the ways of possessing things is to name them, and one of the ways you disinherit something you have named is you disinherit it of what it was before, and its beginnings begin with the names you have given it. So all of these ideas that ordinarily I would have had to spend years in college for just sent me to the library or to the bookstore where I would buy a book, because I hate not owning the book I've read something from. It's in a way of, I suppose, of possessing the knowledge that's in the book. I can't bear to part with it. And so the garden became not only this place of aesthetic, which, by the way, for me was almost the least interesting part of it, but it became this way of knowing the world, knowing, for instance, I began to have, for instance, interpretations of the Garden of Eden itself, began to have ideas about the notion of the creation of the world, and that the creation of the world wasn't instant, that God had made many worlds and that they were not good, and so the one that was good was the one that was good, but there were many that were not good. I began to have ideas like that, and so I begin to sound like a rabbinical scholar. I'm not. I began to, the Garden of Eden is, the description of it is a design. And I began to understand that there was a difference between creation and design, or at least in my mind. Right. That the garden, for instance, that agriculture, the tree of life, and the tree of knowledge, they are arranged in that way because agriculture almost always, I would say always, comes first in a civilization. You feed yourself, and then once you have enough food, you pursue horticulture, which is knowledge. I began to have ideas like that, that the division of the garden into four is a classic division, arranging of a garden, the quadrilineal, that was the, so I just, the garden to me was just this revelation. Right. That I couldn't stop. I mean, as I got involved in it practically, not just in my head, in history and geography and all that, but as I got involved in my own garden, it began to replicate itself. As for instance, I realized my garden's arrangement was like a map of the Caribbean archipelago. You know, so I would say, oh, that's Cuba, and that's this, and that, you know. So it became consuming in a way that if I had had a proper organized education, it wouldn't have worked that way at all. I mean, if I'd become a geologist or a geographer, which incidentally I began to read about geology for a while, I would not have come across Linnaeus. And so I began to read Linnaeus and bought a book, his first book he published called Hortus Cliffortianus, and understood how that came about. It was just magic. And in that way, spiritual. I suppose I was going to leave out spiritual, but really I would read things, you know, I'd read Captain Cook's journals, which is the second most important voyage for our time, and the voyage that rearranged the world vegetatively.
Yes.
Transformed the vegetable arrangement of the earth.
Yeah.
So for me, that was wow, you know. Or Joseph Banks introducing tea to China, and bringing rubber, the dispersal of you know, or quinine, how important that was for conquest. Oh, it never ends.
Yeah. The layers of both history and meaning and actuality in the garden that you were just plumbing to some extent in terms of the geology and the geography and the history and these layers of meaning. That quote from my garden book about the power of naming something to possess it. There is a quote in the book, that quote, that goes on, and it talks about the idea of naming a plant which at one level erases the history of what it was named by the people before, or and this is, I think, in the part of the book where you're speaking about the dahlia and the history of the dahlia.
Yes.
And you say there that it is a little like locking something with a padlock and throwing the key irretrievably away. And I wanted to ask you about this because I think one of my hopes with my own blind spots being revealed and removed, and, you know, in a very similar way to those of us who love plants and see them everywhere we go, trying to encourage other people to lose their plant blindness and to see plants, that this conversation with you and your writing, especially in those essays for the New Yorker, you really ask people to remove that blinder, and in a way you're unlocking that previously locked knowledge of the fact that the dahlia wasn't always the dahlia. It had a long, rich history before that. Will you explore that a little bit?
Oh, the naming of plants and dispossessing them from their places of origin. It's so much tied up to the possession of people that it's to get into it, you almost want to condemn the plant too. It takes a bit of getting a hold of yourself to realize that the plant is innocent of this. And I have written about my association with the daffodil, because I had to learn a poem about celebrating the beauty of the daffodil when I was a child, and no one had considered that I would never see a daffodil, that I had to take to heart love of something I would never see. And so much of a colonized person's life is like that, a love of something that will never be a part of your life. And I think it leads to a sort of insanity that you incorporate and you make every day. I mean, for instance, we don't have snow at Christmas, but snow is part of Christmas, and an evergreen tree and so on. I think, usually those kinds of thoughts are put in political theory. I mean, I think Fanon has the idea of the that's W.E. Du Bois, but, of people living two lives, which there's no reason why people shouldn't have 2 or 3 or 4 or a dozen consciousnesses, which I think you probably do. But it's the cruelty and the bitterness that's that comes with the renaming of the dahlia, so that I think even people native to Mexico have to call it the dahlia. I don't even know if they remember the name of it. And the Aztecs used the dahlia as a medicine for treating urinary tract diseases, because the dahlia's stem is hollow. So that was their version of the doctrine of signature. You just see all these things that are just transformative, and that even the people like Banks and the great admiration we all have for Kew Gardens, but Kew Gardens was really not a garden. It was an agricultural station. It was just a place to exchange plants from one place or the other. I mean, and that's one of the things that's also interesting to me, is how the aggression and I'm being kind when I use the word aggression about Europeans. So the things they did to other parts of the world, they disguised it under scientific and economic reasoning, globalization, which was just sort of capitalism capitalism has gotten so out of control, though I think it's always out of control. But, for instance, the breadfruit, which in every yard in Antigua, you will see a great big breadfruit tree. And it was sent to the West Indies because as a cheap source of food for slaves, because the planters found that the poor slaves enslaved people had to take time out to grow food, and why not find a source of food that would be readily available but took no cultivation. So all of these things, which are incredibly evil, the intent behind them are incredibly evil, by people who thought they were participating in some sort of advancement of knowledge. I think it's called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, for some of us, is one of the darkest periods of our lives, certainly in regard to the vegetable kingdom. And I call it the vegetable kingdom.
It's an interesting thing, because I think that what I tend to say now when I'm talking about the book in front of live audiences is that the garden is one, and plant love and our relationship to the natural world, right, is one of those great common grounds that everybody gardens, every culture, every time period, whether it's for food or medicine or beauty. And so in times like this, which are so disjointed and so conflicted, even though they were for many people forever, always, that this common ground is one of those places where we, as the diversity of us who love plants, can meet. And even by having the conversation that the dahlia wasn't always the dahlia is part of what starts to unlock this.
Yes.
And I think one of the important things in my mind, you know, as a middle-aged, middle-class white woman who loves plants, is that if there was racism built into the structure of our horticultural world, and there was,
Yes.
then there are gardeners among us who can identify it for what it is,
Yes.
dig it out, cover crop something else better over it,
yes.
and compost it into something better going forward.
That's a great metaphor, but and I will add to that is that we must remember that the plants themselves were innocent of this transgression.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
dahlia, or I can't pronounce the Aztec name, the dahlia didn't do anything.
No, it
And
was used.
It was used
just
in a,
the way.
and we must remember that the plants themselves, sugarcane didn't do anything, cotton didn't do anything.
Right.
It was just cotton,
Yeah.
and someone did something, and it's why I've planted all these thousands of daffodils in honoring Wordsworth, because
That right there,
that's
right?
yeah.
It transforms.
It transforms.
Yeah.
We have, and that's where once you can. Me can say, well, you know, the dahlia didn't do anything, cotton didn't do anything. I grow cotton as an ornamental out of honor, really, again, to redeem the cotton from its horrible history. It didn't do anything, and that's where I feel I begin to enter into a broader conversation with the world of the garden.
Yeah. And one of the things that is, there is a quote in the book, or maybe it's in my interview with you, where you say this very clearly, that, you know, there is redemption possible, but it is up to all of us to be interested and curious and engaged with that redemption.
Yes.
Because all of us also, we take this joy and this sometimes very toxic and confusing and difficult topic, they're both there. And so to remember the joy and use it to be part of the redemption and the transformation that you bring to this work is, it's humbling, and I am grateful.
What you just said comes back again to the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, that the garden in all its combinations, whether it's food or horticulture, is both life and knowledge.
Yeah. So I would love to finish up by having you read a little bit from the end of your book, Among Flowers, which is being reissued this fall. With a new introduction and a new cover. And it is a wonderful journal of Jamaica's journey looking for plants in their own places. So look for this reissue this fall. Let's have you start, I think, Jamaica, right here, and go straight to the end.
Oh, very well. As I walked and observed each plant, be it tree, shrub, or herbaceous perennial, seemed perfect in its setting or in its siting. I was, in fact, looking at nature, or the thing called so, and I was also looking at a garden. The garden is an invention. The garden is an awareness, a self-consciousness, an artifice. We think and feel that we are making something natural when we make a garden, something that, if come upon unexpectedly, is a pleasure to behold, something that banishes the idea of order and hard work and disappointments and sadness, even as the garden is sometimes made up of nothing but all that. Eden is never far from the gardener's mind. It is the garden to which we all refer, whether we know it or not, and it is forever out of reach. As I walked up and down the terrain in the foothills of the Himalaya, looking for plants appropriate for growing in the garden looking for plants appropriate for the garden I am now, even now, for the garden is ongoing and a stop to it means death. Making in Vermont, the strangeness of my situation was not lost to me. Vermont all by itself should be Eden and garden worthy enough, but apparently I do not find it so. I seem to believe that I will find my ideal, more a true ideal, only if I can populate it with plants from another side of the world.
I think if there is one thing that I would hope that any reader or viewer would take from this conversation and the writing and voice of Jamaica Kincaid, as well as all of the women in the earth in her hands, it is the reminder that gardens are not just nice, they are absolutely necessary in our world. And gardens and gardeners are powerful intersectional agents of change for the better in all arenas of our life. As we sit here in the New York Botanical Gardens in a day and a week and a month in which the world has ground to a halt in many ways and become chaotic, it is a powerful reminder that the garden is a place of grounding and hope and growing and connecting with one another.